The winter of 1882 had settled upon the Wyoming Territory like a shroud of iron and ice. The vast prairies stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of old pewter, where clouds hung low and heavy with the promise of more snow. Wind cut across the grasslands with a keening wail, carrying with it the bite of temperatures that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. The town of Cedar Ridge huddled against the base of the foothills like a collection of wooden blocks thrown carelessly by a giant's hand. It wasn't much to look at, a main street of frozen mud, flanked by weathered buildings that leaned against each other for support. The saloon's painted signs swung on rusted chains, creaking a lonesome tune. Across the way, the small chapel's steeple pierced the gray sky, its bells silent in the bitter cold. Nora Sullivan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the frost-covered window of her cabin. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the street, knowing what was coming. Her hands, once soft and pale, now bore the calluses and cracks of hard labor. At 26, she felt decades older, worn down by grief and the relentless struggle to survive. "Mama, I'm hungry." The small voice belonged to her daughter, Emma, just 6 years old with her father's dark hair but her mother's green eyes. "I know, sweet one," Nora whispered, turning from the window. "Just a little longer." Her son Thomas, 8 and trying so hard to be the man of the house since his father's death, sat by the dying fire, whittling a piece of wood with his grandfather's old knife. He didn't complain about the hunger anymore, but Nora could see it in the hollow of his cheeks, the way his clothes hung loose on his small frame. The larder stood empty save for a handful of flour and some dried beans. The last of their chickens had been sold 2 weeks ago to buy medicine for Emma's cough. Now, even that money was gone, and the wolves were circling, not the 4-legged kind that howled in the distant mountains, but the 2-legged variety that wore fine coats and carried leather ledgers. A hard knock rattled the door. Thomas jumped, his knife clattering to the floor. Nora's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to walk slowly, steadily. She knew who it would be. Josiah Blackwood filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out what little light remained of the day. Behind him stood 2 of his men, hands resting on the butts of their revolvers. Blackwood's face was fleshy and red from the cold, his small eyes glittering with the satisfaction of a predator who has cornered his prey. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. "I trust you have my money?" "Mr. Blackwood, please," Nora began, but he held up a gloved hand. "Your husband borrowed $300 from me, ma'am, with interest. That sum has grown considerably. I've been patient, more patient than I ought to have been, considering." His eyes roamed over her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "But patience has its limits." "My husband is dead," Nora said, lifting her chin. "He died owing you nothing. Those debts were secured against this property." Blackwood interrupted, producing a paper from his coat. "Your late husband's signature is right here. The cabin, the land, everything. Due in full by week's end, or you and your brats will be put out." "But it's winter." The words burst from her before she could stop them. "You can't I?" Blackwood's smile was cold as the wind outside. "The law's on my side, Mrs. Sullivan, though perhaps—" He paused, his gaze lingering on her face. "Perhaps we could come to some other arrangement. A woman like you, still young, still appealing. There are ways to clear a debt that don't involve money." Nora's hands clenched into fists beneath her shawl. Behind her, she heard Thomas move, probably reaching for his knife again. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house." Blackwood's smile vanished. 3 days, Mrs. Sullivan. After that, the sheriff and I will return to enforce the law. And I warn you, if you're thinking of running, well, there's nowhere in this territory you can hide from me." They left, but their presence lingered like a foul smell. Nora bolted the door and leaned against it, her legs trembling. Emma had started to cry, and Thomas stood with his small fists clenched, his face red with impotent rage. That night, after the children had fallen into fitful sleep. Nora made her decision. She couldn't pay Blackwood. Her husband had left them nothing but debts and bitter memories. The townspeople, who whispered behind their hands about her husband's gambling and drinking, about the bruises she'd tried to hide, would offer no help. The preacher spoke of Christian charity from his pulpit, but had turned her away when she'd asked for assistance. By the light of a single candle, she packed what little they had, 2 changes of clothes each, the family Bible, her mother's silver locket, the one thing she'd refused to sell, a bag of flour, the beans, matches, and her husband's old hunting rifle with a handful of cartridges. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She woke the children before dawn. "We're going on an adventure," she told them, forcing brightness into her voice. Thomas saw through it immediately, but he said nothing, helping his sister into her coat. They slipped out the back door as the first pale light touched the eastern sky. The town still slept, and their footsteps crunched too loudly on the frozen ground. At the edge of town, Nora paused to look back one last time at the cabin that had been their home, their prison. Then she turned her face toward the mountains. The forest began where the prairie ended, a dark wall of pine and spruce that climbed toward peaks lost in cloud. Nora had heard stories of what lay within, bears and wolves, certainly, but also men who'd fled civilization for reasons of their own. Outlaws, hermits, those whom society had broken or who had broken from society. But the forest also meant shelter from the wind, wood for fires, and perhaps game to hunt. Most importantly, it meant distance between her children and Josiah Blackwood. They entered the tree line as the sun climbed higher, its weak light filtering through the branches. The snow lay deeper here, caught in drifts between the massive trunks. Emma struggled, her short legs sinking with each step, until Thomas fashioned a kind of drag from pine branches where she could sit while he pulled. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 5 miles, far too little. Nora knew. Her own feet were numb in her worn boots, and the children shivered despite their constant movement. She found a cluster of rocks that provided some shelter from the wind and set about making camp. The matches were precious, but they needed fire or they would freeze. As flames finally caught in the small pile of kindling, Nora allowed herself a moment of despair. What kind of mother dragged her children into the wilderness in winter? But what kind of mother would let them be thrown into the street, or worse, let them see her degrade herself to pay their father's debts? The night sounds began, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of wolves, the crack of branches in the cold. Thomas pressed closer to his mother, trying to look brave. Emma buried her face in Nora's skirts. They shared the meager meal of beans boiled in melted snow, and Nora told them stories of her own childhood in Ohio, before she'd met their father, before everything had gone so wrong. She didn't sleep. Every sound might be a bear, a wolf pack, or worse, Blackwood's men following their trail. The rifle lay across her lap, loaded and ready, though she'd only ever shot at targets and wasn't sure she could hit anything in the dark. The children's breathing eventually deepened into exhausted sleep, and Nora kept her vigil, praying to a God she wasn't sure still listened to desperate women who'd run out of options. As the fire died to embers and the cold crept in like a living thing, Nora Sullivan faced the truth. They couldn't survive this way. She needed help, needed food and shelter, needed a miracle. Somewhere in these mountains, there had to be something, someone. There had to be hope, even for a widow with 2 children and nothing to offer but desperation and the promise to do whatever it took to keep her babies alive. The wolf howled again, closer this time, and Nora's hand tightened on the rifle. Tomorrow, she would have to find salvation, or they would perish in this frozen wilderness. There was no going back now. Josiah Blackwood and his threats waited behind them. Ahead lay only the unknown forest and the faint hope that somewhere in its depths, mercy still existed for those who had nowhere else to turn. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the mountain wilderness. Ice crystals hung in the air like suspended diamonds, each breath burning in Nora's lungs. The children stirred against her, and she felt the stiffness in her joints from a night spent propped against cold stone. The fire had died hours ago, leaving only white ash and the acrid smell of smoke. "We need to move," she whispered, gently shaking Thomas awake. Emma whimpered. Her lips tinged blue despite the layers of clothing. They broke their pitiful camp and continued deeper into the forest. The terrain grew steeper, rocky outcroppings jutting from the snow like broken teeth. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the weak winter light. In the gloom beneath, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. It was Thomas who heard them first, voices carrying on the still air, rough laughter, the clink of metal against metal. Nora's blood turned to ice water. She grabbed both children, pulling them behind a massive fallen log just as 3 men emerged from the trees ahead. Road agents. She recognized the type immediately. Unwashed, heavily armed, wearing an assortment of stolen clothing, these were men who preyed on travelers, who took what they wanted and left bodies in shallow graves. The largest of them, a bear of a man with a grizzled beard, carried a Henry rifle. The others had pistols tucked into their belts. "Told you I saw smoke last night," the bearded one said. "Someone made camp here. Could have moved on." Another replied, younger, with a pock-marked face. "These tracks look fresh, though." Nora pressed her hand over Emma's mouth as the child began to whimper. Thomas lay rigid beside her, barely breathing. The rifle was trapped beneath her, impossible to reach without movement that would surely give them away. "Woman and children, by the look of it," the third man observed, crouching by their footprints. This one was lean and sharp-featured, with pale eyes that missed nothing. "Small boots, they can't have gone far." Well, the bearded leader grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "A woman traveling alone with young ones in winter must be running from something, or someone. Either way, she's got to have supplies, maybe more." They began to spread out, searching methodically. Nora's mind raced. They couldn't run. Emma was too small, too slow. Fighting was impossible. 3 armed men against 1 desperate woman would end only one way. Then, from somewhere, high on the ridge above, came the sharp crack of a rifle. Snow exploded from a tree trunk inches from the bearded man's head. He cursed, diving for cover as his companions scattered. "Who's there?" the leader shouted. "Show yourself!" Another shot, this one striking the ground at the younger man's feet, sending him scrambling backward. The lean one had already taken cover, his pistol drawn, eyes scanning the tree line above. "This is our territory," the leader called out. "We don't take kindly to—" A third shot cut him off, this one so close it knocked his hat from his head. The message was clear. Leave, or the next one wouldn't miss. "It's him," the lean man hissed. "The mountain man, the one Crenshaw warned us about." "Just one man," the leader snarled, but Nora could hear the fear creeping into his voice. "One man who never misses," the younger one said, already backing away. "I ain't dying for whatever's in some woman's pack." A long silence stretched out. Nora could feel Emma trembling against her, could hear Thomas's quick, shallow breathing. Then, with a string of curses, the bearded leader gestured to his men. They melted back into the forest, moving quickly despite their attempt to appear unhurried. Within minutes, they were gone. Nora waited, counting her heartbeats. 100, 200. Only then did she dare to move, slowly extracting herself and the children from their hiding place. Her legs shook as she stood, scanning the ridge above. But whoever their savior was, he remained invisible among the rocks and trees. "Mama," Thomas whispered. "Who was that?" "I don't know," she admitted, gathering their scattered belongings. "But we owe him our lives." They continued on, following what might have been an old game trail winding higher into the mountains. The mysterious shooter didn't show himself, but Nora felt his presence. A sensation of being watched that should have been frightening, but instead felt oddly protective. Someone knew they were here. Someone with the skill and inclination to drive off road agents. Perhaps the same someone had left the trail they now followed. The day wore on, colder than the one before. Snow began to fall, fat flakes that quickly covered their tracks. Emma grew quieter, her energy fading. And finally, Thomas had to carry her on his back despite his own exhaustion. Nora's feet had gone beyond numb to a burning agony with each step. It was late afternoon when disaster struck. The trail curved around a steep slope where snow had accumulated in a deep drift. Thomas, burdened with his sister, placed his foot wrong. The snow gave way beneath him, and he tumbled sideways with a cry of pain. Nora lunged forward, catching Emma as she fell from her brother's back. Thomas rolled several feet before coming to rest against a boulder, his face contorted in pain. Clutching his ankle, it twisted. He gasped, trying to be brave even as tears leaked from his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry." "Hush now," Nora soothed, though her heart sank. She examined the ankle, already swelling inside his boot. Not broken, she thought, but badly sprained. Walking was out of the question. Night was falling. The temperature plummeted. Snow continued to fall, heavier now, beginning to pile up around them. Nora looked at her children, Thomas trying not to cry, Emma barely conscious from cold and hunger, and felt despair threaten to overwhelm her. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. They would die here, frozen in this wilderness, and it would be her fault for running, for thinking she could save them this way. That's when she saw them, footprints in the snow, fresh ones, leading up the slope, human footprints, made by someone wearing proper boots, not moccasins. Someone had been here recently, perhaps even watching them. Her eyes followed the trail up through the trees. And there, was that smoke? Yes, definitely smoke, rising from somewhere beyond the next ridge. Hope, dangerous and desperate, flared in her chest. Whoever it was might help them, or might be worse than the road agents. But what choice did she have? Her children were dying. She fashioned a rough crutch for Thomas from a sturdy branch and helped him stand. Emma she carried in her arms, the child's weight feeling heavier with each step. Following the footprints, they climbed. The snow fell thicker, wind picking up to drive it into their faces. Nora's world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the warmth of her daughter's body against her chest and the sound of her son's labored breathing beside her. The trees thinned. The footprints led over a rise and down into a small valley, sheltered on three sides by steep slopes. And there, like something from a dream, stood a cabin. Real logs, real walls, a real roof heavy with snow. A stone chimney released a steady stream of smoke into the darkening sky. Warm light glowed from a single window, promising heat, shelter, life. Nora staggered the last few yards to the heavy wooden door. She had no strength left to knock, could barely stand. Thomas leaned heavily on his crutch beside her, and Emma lay still as death in her arms. With her last energy, she called out, her voice cracking, "Please, is anyone there? My children, please!" The silence stretched out so long she thought perhaps she'd imagined the cabin, that madness had finally taken her and she was dying in the snow, dreaming of salvation. Then came the sound of a heavy bar being lifted, and the door swung inward. Golden firelight spilled out into the gathering dark, and with it came blessed warmth. Silhouetted in the doorway stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing rough homespun and leather. Nora couldn't make out his features against the backlight, but she saw him take in the scene. A desperate woman with two freezing children, one injured, all of them at the very end of endurance. For a moment that lasted eternity. He stood there. Nora swayed on her feet, Emma a dead weight in her arms, and she knew that if he closed that door, they would die. They had nothing left, nowhere else to go. This stranger in his remote cabin was their last hope in all the world. The man stepped aside, no words, just that simple gesture, an invitation, an offer of shelter. Nora stumbled forward into warmth and light, tears freezing on her cheeks, carrying her daughter while Thomas hobbled in behind. The door closed against the bitter night, and for the first time in days, they were safe from the cold. But as Nora's eyes adjusted to the light and she got her first real look at their savior, she wondered if they had simply traded one danger for another, for this was clearly a man who had chosen isolation. who had built his refuge far from civilization for reasons of his own. A man who could shoot well enough to drive off 3 armed bandits without showing himself. A man whose cabin walls bore the marks of violence, scratches that might have been from bear claws, or might have been from something else entirely. She clutched her children closer, meeting the stranger's gaze. Whatever happened next, whatever price he might demand for his help, she would pay it. She had to, because outside, the storm was building into a blizzard, and the only thing standing between her babies and death was this silent man and the sanctuary he offered. The die was cast. There was no turning back now. The warmth hit Nora like a physical blow, making her knees buckle. The man moved swiftly, catching her elbow with one large hand, steadying her before she could fall. Up close, she could see him clearly now, weathered face half hidden by a thick beard. Dark hair shot through with premature gray, eyes the color of winter sky. Deep lines etched his features. Speaking of years spent squinting into sun and snow, he might have been 35 or 50. The mountains aged a man in ways that defied counting. "Set the child here," he said, his voice rough from disuse, gesturing to a crude but sturdy settee near the fireplace. "The boy needs that ankle looked at." Nora laid Emma down gently, her arms trembling from exhaustion and relief. The little girl's breathing was shallow but steady. Thomas limped to a chair, trying to look braver than his 8 years warranted. The cabin's interior revealed itself in the dancing firelight. One room, but larger than it appeared from outside. Elk antlers served as hooks for clothing and gear. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with preserves, dried goods, ammunition. Pelts covered the floor. Bear, wolf, deer. In the corner stood a narrow bed with a straw mattress and wool blankets. Everything spoke of practical solitude, a life pared down to essentials. The man crouched before Thomas, his movements careful, deliberate. "Let me see," he said, and something in his tone brooked no argument. Thomas nodded, biting his lip as the stranger gently removed his boot. The ankle had swollen badly, purple bruising already spreading. "Not broken," the man confirmed. "But it needs binding." He moved to a chest and withdrew strips of clean cloth. His hands, Nora noticed, were surprisingly gentle as he wrapped the injury. Thomas winced but didn't cry out. "Thank you," Nora whispered, the words inadequate for what he'd already done, driving off the road agents, offering shelter. I'm Mrs. Sullivan, Nora Sullivan. These are my children, Thomas and Emma." The man glanced up briefly. "Elias Fletcher," he said, returning his attention to Thomas's ankle. Nothing more, no questions about what they were doing in his mountains, though surely he wondered. Emma stirred on the settee, whimpering. Nora went to her, feeling her forehead too warm, despite the child's shivers. "She needs food," Nora said, hating how the words sounded like begging. "They both do. We haven't—" "It's been 2 days since—" Elias rose, moving to the fireplace where an iron pot hung over the flames. The smell that wafted out when he lifted the lid made Nora's stomach clench with hunger. Venison stew, rich with wild onions and herbs. Without a word, he ladled portions into wooden bowls, handed them around. The children fell on the food like young wolves. Nora forced herself to eat slowly. Though her body screamed for nourishment, the stew was better than anything she'd tasted in months, hot, filling, seasoned with knowledge of the wild. Elias ate standing by the window, occasionally peering out at the storm that now raged in earnest. When the bowls were empty, he refilled them without being asked. Color began returning to Emma's cheeks. Thomas's eyes grew heavy. The warmth, the food, the safety. It was overwhelming after their ordeal. "They can have the bed," Elias said abruptly. "You'll take the settee. I'll make do." "We can't put you out of your own—" "You can and you will." His tone wasn't harsh, merely final. Children need proper rest to heal. As Nora helped her children to the narrow bed, tucking them under the heavy blankets, she became acutely aware of their benefactor's scrutiny. He sat by the fire now, cleaning a rifle, the same weapon, she supposed. that had saved them earlier. His movements were automatic, hands knowing their work without conscious thought, but his eyes kept returning to her. "You're running from something," he said finally. Not a question. Nora straightened, met his gaze. She owed him truth. At least, "My husband died, left debts. The man who holds them wants—" She couldn't finish, but understanding flickered in Elias's eyes. This debt holder have a name. Josiah Blackwood, from Cedar Ridge. Something dark passed over Elias's features. "I know of him. Snake of a man, hiding behind the law." He set the rifle aside. "How much?" $300. "More with interest." The numbers tasted bitter. "More than I'll see in a lifetime." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind howling outside and the pop of burning wood. Nora felt the weight of the moment pressing down. She knew what came next, had steeled herself for it during the bitter trek through the forest. Men like Elias Fletcher didn't offer charity. Everything had a price. She thought of the road agents, of Blackwood's leering suggestions, of all the ways a desperate woman could be made to pay for protection. Her husband had taught her that lesson well enough, with fists and worse, but for her children, she would endure anything. "Mr. Fletcher," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "I know I have no right to your help. We've invaded your home, eaten your food. I have nothing to offer in payment except—" She swallowed hard, forced herself to continue. "Except myself. I can cook, clean, tend your house, and if you require more—" The words hung in the air like ice crystals. Elias's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He stood slowly, and Nora instinctively stepped back, though she kept her chin raised. "Is that what you think?" he asked quietly. "That I'm the kind of man who'd take payment from a desperate woman?" "I think you're a man living alone in the wilderness," Nora replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "I think survival here means being practical. And I think—" her voice cracked slightly. "I think a mother does what she must." Elias studied her for a long moment. Then he turned away, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. "You think wrong, Mrs. Sullivan, about what kind of man I am, about what I'd ask of anyone under my roof." He paused. "That settee's comfortable enough. There's extra blankets in the chest. Storm should blow itself out by morning." Confused, Nora watched as he pulled on a heavy coat and checked his rifle. "Where are you going?" "Need to check the perimeter. Set some alarms in case your Mr. Blackwood has trackers worth their salt." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Bar this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times. Pause, then twice more." "But the storm—" "I've weathered worse." He glanced back at her. "Your children are safe here, Mrs. Sullivan. You have my word on that. But come morning, we'll need to talk plain about what happens next. This cabin's no place for young ones long term, and Blackwood won't give up easy." Then he was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Nora barred the door as instructed, her mind reeling. She'd prepared herself for degradation, for survival at any cost. Instead, this strange, dangerous man had offered simple humanity. It unsettled her more than threats would have. She checked on the children, sleeping peacefully, warm and fed for the first time in days. Emma's fever had broken. Thomas's foot was properly elevated. Small miracles in themselves. Settling onto the settee with the promised blankets, Nora found herself studying the cabin more closely. There were personal touches she'd missed before. Books on a high shelf. A chess set carved from antler. A daguerreotype tucked behind a lantern showing a younger Elias in uniform with a woman and small child. Family. She realized, but where were they now? The war, probably. It had taken so many, left so many broken. Is that what had driven him here, to this isolated existence? She understood the impulse. After all, wasn't she fleeing civilization's cruelties herself? The knock came an hour later. 3 raps. Pause. 2 more. Nora lifted the bar, and Elias entered in a swirl of snow. Ice crusted his beard. But his color was good. His movement sure. "Perimeter secure. he reported, shaking snow from his coat. Set some snares, too. Might have fresh rabbit come morning. He settled into a chair by the dying fire, and silence fell again. But it was a different silence now, almost companionable. The storm raged outside, but inside was warmth, safety, a temporary peace. That offer, Nora said suddenly, needing to clear the air. What I said before, I meant it. If you change your mind, I won't. His voice was firm. Whatever you've been taught about what you're worth, what you have to trade for survival, forget it. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? She asked, genuinely puzzled. Nothing's free, not in this world. Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, maybe that's true, but some debts aren't meant to be paid. Some things a man does because it's right, because he can, because... He trailed off, staring into the embers. Because what? Because once, someone should have helped, and didn't. And a man carries that weight forever. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. The daguerreotype, the empty cabin, the self-imposed exile, pieces of a tragedy Nora could only guess at. She wanted to ask, to offer comfort in return for his kindness, but instinct held her back. Some wounds weren't meant to be probed by strangers. Instead, she pulled the blankets closer and said simply, "Thank you." Elias nodded once, then closed his eyes, settling deeper into his chair. He would sleep there, she realized, keeping watch even in rest, protecting them as he'd done from the moment he'd fired those warning shots at the road agents. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Nora's last thought was a prayer of gratitude for this unlikely sanctuary and the complicated man who offered it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Blackwood's pursuit, decisions about the future, the reality of their precarious situation. But tonight, with the blizzard sealing them away from the world, her children were safe. It was enough. For now. It was everything. Morning came late to the mountain valley, filtered through heavy clouds that promised more snow. Nora woke to the sound of quiet movement and the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd grown accustomed to. Elias stood at the stove, his back to her, working with the same economical movements she'd noticed the night before. The children still slept. Emma curled against Thomas like a kitten in the gentle morning light. Nora could see her daughter's color had returned to normal, her breathing deep and even. The relief was so profound it made her dizzy. "Coffee's ready," Elias said without turning. "Biscuits too, though they're nothing fancy." Nora rose, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and smoothed her dress as best she could. It was travel-stained and torn in places, but vanity seemed foolish here. She accepted the steaming mug gratefully, wrapping both hands around its warmth. "You were up early," she observed. "Always am. Check the snares? Got 2 rabbits. They'll make good stew." He set a plate of biscuits on the rough table. "Your boy's ankle looks better. Swelling's down some." They ate in companionable silence, the coffee bitter but warming. Outside, snow continued to fall, though lighter than the night's blizzard. The world beyond the windows was white and still, beautiful in its deadly peace. "I should start earning our keep," Nora said, setting down her mug. "The dishes, the cleaning." "Sit," Elias commanded, not unkindly. "You're still exhausted. Rest today. Tomorrow's soon enough for figuring out arrangements." Emma stirred then, whimpering softly. Nora went to her, feeling her forehead, cool now, the fever truly broken. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then wondrous as she took in their surroundings. "Mama, are we in heaven?" "No, sweetheart. We're safe. A kind man is helping us." Emma's gaze found Elias, who had turned from the stove to watch. She studied him with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you a giant?" she asked solemnly. "From the fairy stories?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across Elias's features. "No giants here, little one. Just a man with breakfast, hungry." As the children ate, Thomas attacking his biscuits with renewed appetite, Emma nibbling more cautiously, Nora found herself studying their host. In daylight, she could see more clearly the marks life had left on him. A scar ran from his left temple into his hairline. His hands, though gentle with the children, bore old wounds, burns, cuts, the kind of damage that came from violence rather than mere hard living. "You were a soldier," she said quietly, while the children were distracted. Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Was the war? Among other things. He refilled his coffee, movements deliberate. "That's done now." The finality in his tone closed that avenue of conversation. But Nora had learned to read men's silences, and his spoke of losses too deep for words. She thought again of the daguerreotype, the woman and child frozen in time. After breakfast, Elias showed Thomas how to keep weight off his injured ankle while still moving about. The boy watched with rapt attention as Elias demonstrated the proper use of the makeshift crutch, clearly in awe of this mountain man who had saved them. "Can you show me the snares?" Thomas asked eagerly. "I want to learn." "When that ankle's healed," Elias promised. "Man who can't run shouldn't be checking trap lines. Bears aren't all hibernating yet." Thomas's eyes widened. "You fought bears. When I had to?" Elias's tone was matter of fact. "Rather avoid them when possible, like most troubles in life." As the morning progressed, a routine emerged. Elias went about his daily tasks, maintaining the fire, checking supplies, cleaning weapons, while Nora gradually took over the domestic sphere despite his protests. She swept the floor, organized the shelves, mended a torn shirt she found in his belongings. It felt good to be useful, to repay kindness with service. Emma, still weak but improving, sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire, playing with a set of carved wooden animals Elias produced from somewhere. Thomas peppered Elias with questions about hunting, trapping, survival in the mountains. The man answered patiently, teaching without seeming to. It was during the noon meal, rabbit stew as promised, that Elias finally broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "We need to speak plain about your situation," he said, setting down his spoon. "Blackwood won't let a debt that size go. He's got legal claim to your property. You can't go back to Cedar Ridge." "I know," Nora replied quietly. "I thought perhaps another town. Start fresh." "With what money? What skills?" His tone wasn't cruel, merely practical. A widow with 2 young children, no funds, no references. Most places won't even rent you a room. The truth of it sat heavy between them. Nora had known, of course, but hearing it stated so baldly made their desperation fresh again. There might be another way. Elias continued slowly. "I do business in Fort Laramie twice a year, trade pelts, buy supplies. The sutler there, James Morrison. His wife runs a boarding house. Respectable place. She might have work for a woman with domestic skills." Hope flared in Nora's chest. "When do you next go?" "Not till spring thaw. March, maybe April." He paused. "You'd need to winter here." The implications hung in the air. Months in this isolated cabin, dependent on his charity. 3 extra mouths to feed through the lean season. And the propriety of it, a widow sharing quarters with a single man, even with children present. If word got back to civilization, "I couldn't impose." "Not imposing if you work for it." Elias interrupted. "This place needs a woman's touch. Mending, cooking, preserving. Come spring, I'll have extra pelts to trade because I won't be doing those chores myself. We both benefit. And my reputation." A harsh sound that might have been laughter escaped him. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're a day's hard ride from the nearest neighbor. Only reputation that matters up here is whether you pull your weight and keep your word." Emma had fallen asleep again, curled in her blanket nest. Thomas listened intently, understanding more than a boy his age should about their precarious position. "What about Blackwood?" Nora asked. "He might come looking." "Let him," Elias said flatly. "This is my land, legal and proper. Bought it from the territory office. Have the papers to prove it. He sets foot here without my permission. He's trespassing." Mountain justice is different from town law." The implicit threat in his words should have frightened her. Instead, Nora felt oddly reassured. This man would protect them, had already proven it. But still. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why help us? You don't know us, owe us nothing. Why take such trouble for strangers?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Maybe because I've been the stranger in need. Maybe because those children deserve better than cold and hunger. Or maybe—" He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Maybe a man gets tired of an empty house and his own ghosts for company." The honesty of it took her breath away. Not charity then, but mutual need. He was offering them survival. They were offering him something harder to define: companionship, purpose. The sound of children's laughter in a too-quiet home. "There would need to be rules," Nora said carefully. "Boundaries. For all our sakes." "Agreed. You'll have the bed with the children. I'll build a partition for privacy. You handle the house, I'll handle the hunting and heavy work. Come trouble, we face it together." "Fair?" Nora looked at her children. Thomas trying to be brave and grown up. Emma fragile as spun glass, but slowly strengthening. She thought of Blackwood's threats, of winter winds and empty bellies, of all the ways the world crushed those without protection. "Fair," she agreed, and felt fate click into place like a well-oiled lock. That afternoon, while snow continued to fall softly outside, they began the delicate process of making a shared life. Elias showed her where everything was kept, explained his systems for food storage and preservation. Nora took inventory of what needed mending, what could be improved with a woman's attention to detail. Thomas, despite his injury, insisted on helping Elias bring in firewood, hopping determinedly on his good foot. Emma woke long enough to eat again, and shyly asked Elias if he knew any stories. "A few," he admitted, and proceeded to tell a tale about a clever rabbit outwitting a hungry wolf, using different voices that made Emma giggle, a sound that seemed to surprise Elias as much as it delighted him. As evening fell and they gathered for another simple meal, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in years, not quite peace, but the possibility of it. This strange arrangement might work. It had to work. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their unlikely sanctuary. Whatever came next, Blackwood's pursuit, the challenges of winter, the complex navigation of sharing space with this dangerous, damaged, unexpectedly kind man, they would face it together. For now, in this moment, with their children safe and fed and a roof over their heads. It was enough. Tomorrow could bring its own worries. Tonight, she would simply be grateful for the mysterious providence that had led them to Elias Fletcher's door. Dawn crept across the mountain peaks like spilled honey, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and rose. Nora stood at the cabin window, watching the light transform the harsh landscape into something almost magical. 3 weeks had passed since they'd stumbled through Elias Fletcher's door, and the rhythm of their shared existence had settled into something approaching normalcy. Behind her, she heard Emma's soft breathing from the bed, now partitioned off with a heavy blanket Elias had strung across rope. Thomas was already up, outside helping Elias check the trap lines despite the early hour. The boy's ankle had healed well, and he'd thrown himself into learning everything Elias would teach him about mountain survival. The coffee was ready when the men, for Thomas insisted he was a man now, returned, stamping snow from their boots and bringing with them the sharp scent of pine and cold air. "Good haul," Elias reported, hanging a brace of rabbits by the door. "Your boy's got a keen eye for tracks." Thomas beamed at the praise, his cheeks red from cold and pride. "Elias says I might be ready to set my own snare soon. After you've proven you can reset mine proper for another week." Elias tempered, but his eyes held warmth as he ruffled the boy's hair. They settled around the rough table for breakfast, venison hash with wild onions, biscuits Nora had perfected using Elias's sourdough starter, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. It was a far cry from the hunger that had driven them here. and Nora sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for this abundance. "I've been thinking," she said as they ate, "about the root cellar you mentioned. If we're to make it through winter proper, we need better food storage." Elias nodded slowly. "Ground's not frozen too deep yet. Could still dig one before the real cold sets in." "I can help," Thomas volunteered eagerly. "So can I." Emma piped up, not to be outdone by her brother. She'd grown stronger each day, the mountain air and regular meals working better than any tonic. Everyone helps. Elias agreed. That's how it works up here. After breakfast, Nora found herself alone with Elias while the children played outside in the snow, their laughter carrying on the still air. She was mending one of his shirts. The man was death on clothing, while he worked on repairing a pack saddle. "You never asked," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "About my husband, about what kind of man he was." Elias's hands never paused in their work. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted. Man's past is his own business. He wasn't a good man." The words came easier than she'd expected. Charming when he wanted something, cruel when he didn't get it. "I married young. Thought I was lucky to catch a man with prospects. Learned different soon enough. The children? He never touched them. That was my line in the sand. But they saw enough, heard enough." She took a shaky breath. "When he died, bar fight over a card game. I thought we were free. Then Blackwood came calling with papers showing debts I never knew existed." Silence stretched between them, comfortable despite the heavy topic. Finally, Elias spoke. "My wife died in childbirth. The baby, too. Doctor said it might have gone different if we'd been near a proper town. But I'd brought them west, chasing dreams of land and fortune." Nora's hand stilled on the mending. "I'm sorry. Sarah was her name. Little Sarah for the baby, though she never drew breath to hear it." He set aside the saddle, staring out the window, buried them on a hillside overlooking the Platte River, stood there for 3 days, trying to find a reason to move. Finally figured the only direction that made sense was away from everything that reminded me of what I'd lost. "Is that why you stay here? Hidden away?" "Partly. Also because I learned something about myself after. The war had already shown me I could kill when necessary. Losing Sarah showed me I could kill when it wasn't. Spent a year hunting the men who sold me that worthless land, promising safety where there was none. Found them too." His voice was flat, emotionless. "After that, seemed best to stay where I couldn't hurt anyone else." Nora absorbed this confession, understanding more about the man who'd saved them. Not just a hermit, but a self-imposed exile, punishing himself for sins real and imagined. "You're not that man anymore," she said softly. "How do you figure?" "That man wouldn't have saved us. Wouldn't be teaching Thomas to read trail sign or making Emma laugh with his stories. Wouldn't be—" She stopped, suddenly aware of what she'd been about to say. Wouldn't be what? His gray eyes found hers, intense and searching. "Wouldn't be healing," she finished quietly. "Any more than we would be without you." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared pain and tentative hope. Elias looked away first, clearing his throat roughly. "Better check on those children. Thomas'll have Emma buried in a snowbank by now." But that night, after the children were asleep, he pulled out a worn Bible and asked if she'd like him to read aloud. They sat by the fire, careful distance between them. While his deep voice brought ancient words to life, it became a ritual. Those evening readings, a bridge between their separate griefs. Days passed in busy preparation for deeper winter. The root cellar was dug with everyone helping, even Emma carrying small buckets of dirt. Elias taught them all to recognize edible winter plants, to read weather signs, to move quietly in the forest. Nora smoked and dried meat, gathered the last hardy herbs, patched every gap in the cabin walls with moss and mud. One evening, as November bent toward December, Elias returned from hunting with news that changed everything. "Riders," he said tersely, checking his rifle. "3 of them, making camp about 5 miles down the mountain. City horses, city gear." Nora's blood ran cold. Blackwood? Most like. Snow's been light enough for travel, and a determined man could track this far. He looked at her steadily. You need to decide now. I can send them off, but it might mean killing. Or you can face them. Hear what they've come to say. They've come to take us back, to take me back. She thought of Blackwood's implications, his thinly veiled threats. I won't go. Then they don't set foot near this cabin, Aaliyah said with finality. But Nora, her given name on his lips was still new, still startling. If I do what needs doing, there's no going back. We become fugitives in truth. The law won't see it as protecting what's mine, but as harboring a debtor and murdering lawful agents. Sssss, Nora looked at her children. Thomas trying to appear brave despite the fear in his eyes. Emma clutching her carved rabbit. She thought of the life they'd begun building here, the safety and dignity Elias offered, the gradual warming between them that might, given time, become something deeper. Then we'd best make sure they never report back, she said, surprising herself with her coldness. Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. If I'm not back by dawn, take the children and head north. There's a trapper's cache about 10 miles up. Supplies enough to get you to Fort Laramie. Elias. She caught his arm as he turned to go. Be careful. We need you to come back. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hope. I always come back, he said gruffly. It's what I do instead of dying. Then he was gone, melting into the darkness with his rifle and grim purpose. Nora barred the door with trembling hands and gathered the children close. Together they waited, listening to the wind and praying for the safety of the man who'd become their unlikely protector. Time crawled like cold honey. Emma dozed fitfully while Thomas kept watch at the window, though there was nothing to see but darkness and swirling snow. Nora found herself thinking of all the small moments that had led to this, Elias teaching Thomas to whittle, his large hands guiding small ones, Emma perched on his knee while he told stories, no longer frightened by his size, the way his eyes found hers across the dinner table, holding conversations without words. When had gratitude become affection? When had this practical arrangement begun to feel like something more? She couldn't say, but she knew with sudden clarity that losing him now would break something in her that had just begun to heal. The knock came just before dawn. 3 raps, pause, 2 more. Nora flew to the door, lifted the bar with desperate hands. Elias stood there, snow-covered but whole, his expression unreadable. It's done, he said simply. They won't be troubling you again. She should have asked for details, should have felt horror at what those words implied. Instead, she felt only relief so profound it weakened her knees. He caught her as she swayed, his arms strong and sure around her. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. Thank you. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, then gently set her aside. We'll need to move their camp come spring thaw. Make it look like they never made it this far. For now, we're safe. Safe. Such a simple word for such a precious thing. As dawn broke fully and the children woke to find their protector returned, Nora realized that somewhere between desperation and gratitude, between shared grief and tentative hope, she'd begun to think of this isolated cabin as home. More than that, she'd begun to think of Elias Fletcher as something more than savior or employer or even friend. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, as she watched him accept Emma's relieved hug and Thomas's eager questions, she felt only a quiet certainty that they belonged here. All of them, bound together by something stronger than law or obligation. Winter was coming in earnest now, but inside the cabin was warmth and light and the promise of survival. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. It was enough. It was everything. The attack came at dawn, 5 days after Elias had turned back the first group. This time, Blackwood had sent more men, professionals, not the usual rabble of debt collectors. Nora woke to the sound of Elias's sharp whistle, their agreed-upon danger signal, followed immediately by the crack of rifle fire. Children, quickly! She pulled Thomas and Emma from bed, pushing them toward the root cellar entrance they'd concealed beneath a heavy rug. Remember what Elias taught us? Stay quiet until one of us comes for you. Thomas grabbed his sister's hand, his young face set with determination. Yes, Mama. As the trapdoor closed over their heads, another shot rang out, followed by shouting. Nora grabbed the spare rifle Elias had taught her to use, checking that it was loaded. Her hands were steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Through the window, she could see them, 6 men using the tree line for cover, slowly advancing on the cabin. Elias was somewhere out there too, using his knowledge of the terrain to even the odds, but 6 against 1. A bullet shattered the window, showering her with glass. Nora dropped below the sill, then cautiously rose and fired at the muzzle flash she'd seen. A cry of pain told her she'd hit her mark. Mrs. Sullivan, Blackwood's voice carried across the snow. He'd come himself this time, standing bold as brass despite the danger. This foolishness has gone on long enough. Come out now and I might still be lenient. Force me to burn you out, and things will go much harder. For answer, she put a bullet into the tree beside his head, close enough to shower him with bark. He dove for cover, cursing. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 1. Elias moved like a ghost, appearing long enough to fire before melting back into the forest. But they were closing in, using their numbers to pin him down. Nora saw one man creeping toward the cabin's blind side and dropped him with a shot that surprised her with its accuracy. Then she heard it, a grunt of pain that was unmistakably Elias. Through the gun smoke, she saw him stumble, his left arm hanging useless, blood staining the snow beneath him. 2 men were advancing on his position. Without thinking, Nora burst from the cabin, firing as she ran. Get away from him! The men turned, startled by her fierce charge. One raised his rifle, but Nora's shot took him center mass. The other dove aside, giving Elias the opening he needed. Even wounded, his aim was true. Back to the cabin, Elias shouted, struggling to his feet. They ran together, Nora supporting his weight on his injured side. Bullets whined past them, thinking into the log walls. They tumbled through the door, Elias immediately moving to bar it despite his wound. Let me see, Nora demanded, but he shook his head. They're regrouping. We need... He swayed, catching himself on the table. Blood was spreading across his shirt at an alarming rate. Nora pushed him into a chair, tearing at the fabric to expose the wound. The bullet had passed through the meat of his upper arm, missing the bone but leaving ragged holes front and back. Hold still, she commanded, grabbing the whiskey and clean cloth they kept for emergencies. He hissed as she cleaned the wound but didn't pull away. Blackwood, Elias called out while she worked. You've got dead men out there. Turn back now, or join them. You're outnumbered and wounded. Fletcher, came the reply. This ends one way. Maybe. Elias agreed, his voice steady despite the pain. But how many more men are you willing to lose? I've got ammunition enough to make it costly. Silence fell. Nora finished binding the wound, noting with relief that the bleeding had slowed. Elias caught her hand as she pulled away. The children? Safe in the cellar. Good. He squeezed her fingers. If this goes bad, it won't, she said fiercely. We've come too far to fail now. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. You've got spine. Nora Sullivan. Never doubt that. A white flag appeared at the tree line, a shirt tied to a rifle barrel. Blackwood emerged slowly, hands visible. Parley, he called. I'd speak with you. Fletcher. Elias rose despite Nora's protests. Through the broken window, he answered, Speak your piece from there. You're harboring a fugitive debtor. I've got legal papers. Your papers aren't worth spit up here. Elias cut him off. This is my land, my home. The woman and her children are under my protection. Protection. Blackwood's voice turned sly. Is that what you call it? A man and woman living in sin. Those poor children exposed to such immorality? Nothing immoral about giving shelter to those in need. Elias replied evenly. Unlike forcing a widow to alternative payments for manufactured debts. Even at a distance, they could see Blackwood's face darken. "Those debts are real and legal." "Legal, maybe. Real." Elias laughed harshly. "We both know Sullivan died owing you maybe $50. The rest is interest and fees you've invented. Regardless, the law. The law is a day's ride away." Elias interrupted. "Up here, there's my law. And my law says you and what's left of your men have 10 minutes to collect your debt and ride out. Don't come back. You can't hide her forever. Fletcher, I'll return with the sheriff. A proper posse. Try it." Elias's voice was deadly quiet. "But know this. I've written letters. To the territorial governor, to the federal marshal, to newspapermen in Cheyenne. All about your practices, your manufactured debts, the widows you forced into, arrangements. Those letters are with a friend. Anything happens to me or mine, they get sent." Nora watched Blackwood's face cycle through rage, calculation, and finally, a kind of frustrated defeat. He knew Elias wasn't bluffing. "You've made an enemy today, Fletcher," he said finally. "I've got plenty of those. One more won't cost me sleep." Elias paused. "But think on this. Blackwood, you've lost men today over $300. Is it worth losing more? Is it worth losing everything when those letters get sent?" Long moments passed. Then Blackwood turned and barked orders to his remaining men. They emerged cautiously, gathering the bodies of the fallen. Within half an hour, they were gone, disappearing down the mountain trail. Elias sagged against the wall, exhaustion and blood loss catching up. Nora was there immediately, supporting him. "It's over," she whispered. "For now." He allowed her to help him to a chair. Men like Blackwood don't forget, but he's a coward at heart. Faced with the real consequences, he'll find easier prey. Nora fetched the children from the cellar. They emerged wide-eyed but unharmed, immediately clustering around Elias. "You're hurt," Emma exclaimed, seeing the bandages. "Just a scratch," he assured her, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Your mother's patched me up fine." Thomas stood very straight. "I wanted to help fight. I could have—" "You did help," Elias cut him off gently. "You protected your sister. A man's first duty is to family. You did yours." As Nora prepared a meal and tended to Elias's wound again, she marveled at how natural this felt. The four of them, united by crisis, moving with the easy coordination of a true family. The children fussed over Elias, bringing him water, adjusting his pillows. He bore their ministrations with gruff patience, occasionally catching Nora's eye with a look of bemused wonder. That evening, as snow began to fall again, covering the signs of battle, Nora found herself sitting beside Elias while the children played quietly nearby. "Those letters," she said, "do they really exist?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "What do you think?" "I think you're cleverer than you let on. Maybe, or maybe I've got friends in low places who owe me favors." He shifted, wincing. "Either way, Blackwood will think twice before coming back." "And if he does," Elias looked at her directly, "then we'll face him together, like we did today." The word "together" hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Nora thought of how they'd fought side by side, how natural it had felt to protect him as he'd protected them. "Elias," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. He reached out with his good hand, covering hers. "I know," he said simply. "Me too." As night fell and the storm intensified, sealing them once again in their mountain sanctuary, Nora allowed herself to hope. They'd survived Blackwood's worst. Elias was wounded but would heal. The children were safe, and between her and this complex, dangerous, protective man, something deeper than gratitude or convenience was taking root. The winter still stretched long before them, but they would face it as they'd faced everything else, together. And maybe, just maybe, when spring came and the snow melted, they'd find that what had begun as desperate necessity had transformed into something worth fighting for, worth building a future on. For now, with a storm raging outside and warmth and light within, it was enough to simply be four souls who'd found each other against all odds, creating their own definition of family in this wild, unforgiving, beautiful place. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, first as a softening of the wind, then as patches of brown earth showing through the snow. The ice on the creek began to crack and sing, and the first green shoots pushed through in sheltered spots. With the thaw came decision time. Nora stood outside the cabin, watching Thomas and Emma play in the mud with the enthusiasm of children who'd been cooped up too long. 4 months they'd been here now. 4 months that had transformed them all. Thomas had grown 2 inches and filled out with good food and hard work. Emma's cheeks were rosy with health, her laughter frequent and unforced. And Elias... She turned to watch him splitting wood, his movements sure despite the scarred arm that still pained him on cold mornings. He'd changed too. The grim silence of their first meeting replaced by something warmer, though he'd never be what anyone would call talkative. "We need to talk," he said that evening after the children were abed. They sat by the fire as had become their custom, but his expression was more serious than usual. "About going to town," Nora said. It wasn't a question. They'd both known this moment would come. The passes are clear enough now. We could make Cedar Ridge in 2 days, 3 with the children. He paused, staring into the flames. "Need to know what you want to do." "What I want." The question surprised her. "I thought we'd decided. Fort Laramie, the boarding house position." "That was before." His gray eyes found hers. "Before Blackwood came. Before things changed between us." Heat rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Things had changed. Slowly, carefully, but undeniably. The casual touches that lingered, the shared glances, the way they moved together with easy familiarity. They'd been dancing around it for weeks now, neither quite willing to name what was growing between them. "What are you saying?" "Elias." He rose abruptly, pacing to the window. "I'm saying you've got choices now. Blackwood's backed off, probably for good. With what happened to his men becoming known, his reputation's in tatters. The town knows he drove you out with false claims. You could go back, reclaim your property, give the children a normal life." "Normal." Nora tested the word. "You mean school, church socials, neighbors who whisper about the widow who lived with a mountain man all winter? They'd forget in time. You're respectable, pretty. Some merchant or farmer would offer marriage soon enough." The words seemed to pain him. Nora stood, moving to face him. "Is that what you think I want? Another husband who sees me as property? Another man to own me? I think you want what's best for your children." "And you don't think that's here, with you?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Elias turned from the window, his expression raw with want and uncertainty. "Nora, I can't offer what a proper man could. I've got blood on my hands, ghosts in my head. I live rough, apart from decent folks for good reason. You deserve better than—" She silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. "Stop. Just stop. Do you think I care about any of that? Do you think the children care? Thomas worships you. Emma runs to you now before me when she's hurt. And I—" "You what?" His voice was rough. "I love you." The words came out in a rush. "I've been trying not to, telling myself it's gratitude or proximity or loneliness, but it's not. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love how you are with my children. I love the man who saved us, asking nothing in return, who fought for us, who made us feel safe for the first time in years." Elias stood frozen, something desperate and hoping warring in his expression. "Nora, I know you loved your wife. I know you blame yourself for what happened. But Elias, you're not that man anymore. And I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm asking if maybe, possibly, you could love again." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with infinite care, he cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Already do," he said simply. "Have for a while now. Just didn't think I had the right." The kiss was gentle, careful, as if they were both made of spun glass. When they pulled apart, Nora was trembling, but not from fear. "So," she said, attempting lightness, "I suppose Fort Laramie is off the table." A smile, rare and transforming, crossed his features. Unless you want to go, what I want is to stay here, to build a life with you. But Elias, the children need education. There's a widow woman, Mrs. Chen, lives about 10 miles north, used to be a school teacher before she married a prospector. She teaches a handful of mountain children. I could build another room on the cabin, make it proper for a family. In a few years, when Thomas is older, maybe we consider moving closer to town. Not Cedar Ridge, but somewhere fresh. You've thought about this. Been thinking about little else, he admitted. But Nora, you need to be sure. Life up here isn't easy. The winters are hard, the work never stops, and while Blackwood might be done, there's always danger. Weather, wild animals, the kind of men who hide in mountains. I know. She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars. But there's nowhere I'd rather be, no one I'd rather face those dangers with. They talked long into the night, planning, dreaming. In the morning, they would tell the children. Thomas, Nora suspected, already knew. The boy missed little. Emma would be delighted to stay in what she called our mountain house. But there was still the matter of town, of facing what they'd run from. Elias was right that some things needed settling. Nora's abandoned property, the legal tangle of debts and claims, and more importantly, if they were to build a life together, it should be done properly, openly. We'll go to Cedar Ridge, Nora decided as dawn approached. All of us, face whatever needs facing, and then, Elias prompted, then we come home. 3 days later, they descended into Cedar Ridge as a family. Nora wore her best dress, carefully mended and pressed. The children were clean and neat. Elias had trimmed his beard and wore his least patched shirt. They made an odd picture, the mountain man, the widow, and 2 children, but they walked with heads high. The town's reaction was immediate and mixed. Whispers followed them down Main Street. Some faces showed hostility, others curiosity, and a surprising number displayed what looked like approval or even relief. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Watson, a decent man who'd always been uncomfortable with Blackwood's methods, listened to their account with growing anger. Wish you'd come to me first, Mrs. Sullivan, he said when they finished. Might have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Blackwood's been under investigation for months. Your case was just the final straw. He's left the territory. Word is he headed California way. And the debts? Elias asked. Judge ruled them void last month. Fraudulent inflation of interest. He called it, the cabin and land are yours free and clear. Mrs. Sullivan. He paused. Though I heard tell it's been vandalized some. Blackwood's men, most like, before they scattered. They visited the property. The sheriff hadn't exaggerated. Windows broken. Door kicked in. Furniture destroyed. But the structure was sound. Elias walked through. Assessing. Could fix it up. He offered, sell it proper. Give you a nest egg. Us, Nora corrected. Give us a nest egg. His smile was answer enough. The next stop was the church. Reverend Mills received them with visible discomfort. But Nora stood firm. We want to be married, she said simply. Properly, in the eyes of God and law. Mrs. Sullivan, surely you understand the irregularity of your situation. Living with this man all winter, unchaperoned save for children. Saving our lives, you mean? Thomas piped up, surprising everyone. Mister, Elias saved us when nobody else would help. When you wouldn't help. The Reverend flushed. Young man. It's true, though. Emma added with a child's devastating honesty. Mama asked you for food and you said no. Mister, Elias gave us food and a home and taught Thomas to trap and tells the best stories and... That's enough, sweetheart, Nora said gently, though she felt a fierce pride in her children's loyalty. She looked back at the Reverend. Will you marry us or not? In the end, he agreed, though with obvious reluctance. The ceremony was set for the next day, a simple affair with Sheriff Watson and his wife as witnesses. But word spread, and when they arrived at the church, they found it surprisingly full. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was there, having always felt guilty for turning Nora away. Doc Morrison attended, remembering how Elias had once brought him a mountain remedy that saved a child's life. Even some of the saloon regulars showed up, rough men who respected Elias's skills and courage. It wasn't the wedding Nora had dreamed of as a girl. But as she stood beside Elias, his hand warm and steady in hers, with her children beaming beside them and unexpected allies filling the pews, she knew it was perfect. When Reverend Mills pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of all the years to come. They spent one night in town, at the boarding house, then loaded their wagon with supplies and headed home. The children chattered excitedly about their plans. Thomas wanted to help build the new room. Emma wanted to plant a garden. As they climbed back into the mountains, leaving the town and its judgments behind, Nora felt a deep contentment settle into her bones. She had a true partner now, a man who'd proven himself in every way that mattered. The children had a father who'd chosen them, fought for them, loved them, and she had a love born of mutual respect, shared trials, and the kind of trust that only comes from facing death together and choosing life. The cabin came into view as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It looked small from this distance, humble, but Nora saw it for what it was: sanctuary. Home, the place where they'd all been reborn. "Welcome home, Mrs. Fletcher," Elias said softly. "Welcome home, Mr. Fletcher," she replied, and knew she meant it with every fiber of her being. This was where they belonged, all of them, in this wild and beautiful place where love had found them against all odds. The summer of 1883 bloomed across the mountains in a riot of wildflowers and bird song. The cabin, once a bachelor's stark refuge, had transformed into a true home. The new room Elias had built stretched along the eastern wall, giving the children space of their own. Garden plots carved from the wilderness yielded vegetables, while Emma's flowers added splashes of color against the weathered logs. Nora stood at the expanded porch, watching her family, for that's what they were now in every way that mattered. Thomas, now tall for his 9 years, worked alongside Elias repairing the chicken coop. Their movements mirrored each other, the boy unconsciously copying the man's economical grace. Emma sat nearby, reading aloud from one of the books Mrs. Chen had lent them, her voice clear and confident. "Mama, Papa Elias, look what I found!" Emma's excited cry interrupted the peaceful morning. She came running from the tree line, clutching something in her small hands. Elias set down his hammer immediately, giving her his full attention, something that still made Nora's heart swell. The gruff mountain man who'd once lived in solitude now responded to a child's call with instant devotion. "What have you got there, little bird?" he asked, crouching to her level. "Baby rabbits. Their mama's gone and they were crying." Emma opened her hands carefully, revealing 2 tiny bundles of fur. Thomas joined them, concerned. "Where did you find them?" "By the old lightning-struck pine. I looked for their mama, but—" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Likely an eagle or coyote got her," Elias said gently. "Nature's way. But these little ones are too young to make it alone." "Can we save them, please?" Emma looked between Elias and Nora with desperate hope. Nora met Elias's eyes over the child's head. They'd had this discussion before, the balance between compassion and the harsh realities of mountain life. But Elias smiled slightly and nodded. "We can try," he said. "Thomas, fetch that old medicine dropper from the supply shelf. Nora, we'll need goat's milk. Warm just so. Emma, you'll need to be very gentle and patient. Baby rabbits are delicate." They spent the morning working together to save the orphaned creatures. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Nora saw it as symbolic of how far they'd all come. The man who'd once isolated himself from all warmth now patiently showed a little girl how to feed baby rabbits. The boy who'd tried too hard to be a man now allowed himself to be young, excited about small lives. And she herself, once driven by mere survival, now had the luxury of fostering compassion in her children. As summer peaked, they received news from town through Mrs. Chen who visited monthly to teach the mountain children. Josiah Blackwood had met his end in California, shot during a dispute over another widow's property. The man who'd driven them into the wilderness was gone, his threats now as insubstantial as morning mist. "Does it change anything?" Elias asked that evening as they sat watching fireflies dance in the meadow. "Knowing he can never come back?" Nora considered, then shook her head. "No, even if he were still alive. I wouldn't want to leave. This is our home now, our life. The children might want different when they're older. Towns, people their own age, opportunities we can't give them here." "Maybe," Nora agreed. "But that's years away. And when that time comes, we'll face it together, like we always do." Elias pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their mountain home. Inside, the children slept peacefully. Emma with the rescued rabbits in a box by her bed. Thomas with a new book on trail signs Elias had traded for in town. Autumn arrived with its spectacular display of gold and crimson, the larder filled with preserved foods, smoked meats, and root vegetables stored against the coming winter. But this year, the approaching cold season brought anticipation rather than dread. They were prepared, united, strong. One October evening, as the first snow dusted the peaks, Nora shared news that would change their family once again. "Elias," she said softly after the children were abed, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, instantly alert to her tone. "What is it?" "I'm with child." The rifle slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. His face cycled through shock, wonder, and then something that looked almost like fear. We're... Yes." She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "Come spring, there'll be a new addition to our family. But the dangers, the isolation. What if something goes wrong? What if... Shh." She pressed her fingers to his lips. "Women have been having babies in these mountains since time began. Mrs. Chen was a midwife before she was a teacher, and Doc Morrison said he'd come if needed, now that the pass roads improved. I can't lose you," Elias said roughly. "Not you, not after—" "You won't," Nora said firmly. "I'm not Sarah, Elias, and this isn't the same. We're not alone on a prairie with no help. We have friends now, resources. We have each other." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She felt him tremble slightly, this man who'd faced down bears and bandits, undone by the prospect of new life. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Our baby," she confirmed. The children took the news with explosive joy. Thomas immediately began planning all the things he'd teach his new sibling, while Emma declared she would share her rescued rabbits, now grown and thriving. The cabin filled with preparations and anticipation. Winter came gentle that year, as if nature itself recognized their need for peace. The snow fell soft and steady, insulating their mountain home in a blanket of white. Inside, life continued its rhythm, lessons with Mrs. Chen, who trudged through snow to keep her appointments. Evenings by the fire with Elias reading aloud while Nora sewed tiny clothes. Days filled with the ordinary miracles of family life. Spring arrived with its usual mountain dramatics, sudden warmth, rushing meltwater, and explosions of green. And on a morning when the wildflowers painted the meadows in celebration, Nora's labor began. It was long but uncomplicated. Mrs. Chen proved as skilled a midwife as she was a teacher, and Elias, despite his terror, was a steady presence throughout. Thomas kept Emma occupied with stories and games, occasionally sneaking anxious glances at the closed bedroom door, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. A new cry joined the sounds of their mountain home. Elias emerged, his face transformed with wonder and relief. "Come meet your sister," he told Thomas and Emma. Little Sarah Fletcher, named for the sister she'd never know but whose memory was no longer only pain, entered the world surrounded by love. As Nora held her daughter, with Elias's arm around them both, and Thomas and Emma pressed close to peer at the tiny face, She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from desperate flight to tentative shelter, from wary alliance to trust, from separate griefs to shared joy. They'd built something beautiful in this wilderness, something worth all the trials that had brought them together. "Look," Emma whispered, pointing out the window. "The deer are coming to see." Sure enough, a small herd of deer had emerged from the forest, grazing peacefully in the meadow, as if bearing witness to this new beginning. The sun's last rays caught their movements, turning the ordinary into magic. "Welcome home, little one," Elias murmured to his daughter. And Nora heard in those simple words all the promise of the future. This child would know only love and security. She would grow up free in these mountains, surrounded by beauty and protected by the fierce devotion of her family. As night fell and stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Nora felt a deep peace settle over her. They'd all traveled hard roads to reach this moment, paths marked by loss, fear, and desperation. But those trials had led them to each other, to this place, to this life they'd built with their own hands and hearts. The cabin stood solid against the mountain wind, smoke rising from the chimney into the star-filled sky. Inside, a family born of necessity, forged by trial and bound by choice, settled in for another night in their wilderness home. The baby slept in her mother's arms. Her siblings whispered excitedly about all they'd show her, and her father kept watch as he always had, as he always would, until his last breath. In the morning, the sun would rise over the mountains, painting their valley in gold. There would be chores to do, lessons to learn, life to live. There would be challenges too, winter storms, summer droughts, the inevitable struggles of raising children far from civilization. But they would meet each challenge as they had all the others, together, with courage, with love. For now, in this perfect moment, with her family complete around her and peace in her heart, Nora Sullivan Fletcher knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The desperate flight that had begun with those words, "Feed my children and I'm yours," had led not to servitude, but to salvation. Not to mere survival, but to a life rich with purpose and joy. The mountains stood eternal, guardians of their happiness, and in their shadow, love had built a home that would shelter generations to come. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Nora and Elias's journey from desperation to hope, from loneliness to love. Where are you listening to this story from? Please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale. Your feedback means everything, and I'd love to hear what touched your heart in this story of courage, family, and finding love in the most unexpected places.